Now, moving on to the next set of vulnerability, which is called XSRF or CSRF or cross-site request forgery. So, cross-site request forgery and cross-site scripting are, sometimes happens, hand in hand actually. And, a typical example that I would say for a cross-site scripting, or I would say a cross-site request forgery is, um, uh, okay, say you have a mobile app, and that is in a banking web application, and you try to log in using your credentials. And what will happen is those credentials are sometimes saved in your cache. And later, what happens is through some social engineering, like a typical phishing or luring into clicking your email in your clicking an URL in your email, the hacker would try to take control of the cache information that you have, and on behalf of you use your tokens, and say here you want he or she, the hacker, wants to perform some bank transactions on the user's behalf, because the user has already logged in and the credentials are saved in their mobile. And typically what happens is the hacker tries to use that, send out multiple HTTP requests, knowing the pattern the user is using, because it's not a just one time activity. The hacker does it. So the hacker, once gets into the mobile application, the mobile of the user, tries to validate or keep a track of all the activity the user is performing. So once the hacker has sufficient information, so what it does is use these credentials, send out multiple requests to the bank's API, and ask the bank to transfer money into a respective account on behalf of the user. And ultimately what happens is the user would not know what is happening, but the hacker is something has taking control of all that from the behind, and making sure that all this is happening. So typically when I faced not faced per se, where back sometime when I was working on AppSec, when I got to know about this vulnerability, this was typically resonating with cross-site scripting. So what exactly the difference between a cross-site scripting and a cross-site request forgery? So there is one little deviation from both. In a cross-site scripting, our typical reflector cross-site or DOM based, the hacker who is taking control of the victim's laptop to perform has the information to see the HTTP response. But for a cross-site request forgery, the hacker can send multiple HTTP requests, but does not have the provision to see the responses. And essentially what happens is the payload has to be crafted in such a way that the API should, the multiple API request the hacker is sending on behalf of the user, has to, work that, the intent is to, transfer accounts, or, transfer the email, change the email IDs and all that. So mostly a post request has to be constructed and sent. So that's how a typical cross-site scripting works. So some of the conditions for a successful cross-site scripting would be, like I told you, right? So the hacker has a typical API to change the email address in a bank website. So can use that API directly, and instead of this email address, the hacker wants to assign a dummy email address the hacker has created to monitor the account. And also if the user is using cookies to handle the sessions, I think there is a high possibility for the hacker to take control of those cookies. And unpredictable request parameters. So you're going to send multiple request parameters, and the APIs calls to the bank and everything, and where you don't know which flow it is. So whatever you send, the bank is accepting, and it is executing. So those are typical conditions where an XSRF can happen, or a cross-site request forgery can happen. So this was a very predominant attack, and have lost a lot of cost for organizations. So here a vulnerable code, it's just a same HTML page, but there is an JavaScript embedded into it, and this is nothing but the vulnerable code is changing the email address to an malicious the email address of the hacker actually. And what will happen is, in the typical HTTP response, when this is being sent by the hacker, would have this email ID changed from the legitimate user's email ID to an email ID of the hacker. Now, how can you prevent this? We had a mitigation pattern. So what happens is, in a typical scenario where a user is accessing the organization's email page to change it, the first time when the legitimate user is trying to access that page, the server would return something called as a CSRF token. So you can see this token here, CSRF equal to WFFISZ. So it will send an CSRF token and would request the client to use the CSRF token while sending the respective next set of respective queries to the server for next of post request or whatever it is, so that even a hacker who's trying to lure it, the server would check for the CSRF token. And in a previous request, there is no CSRF token present here. And what will happen is the server will reject the request, because the server would know that for that person who was accessing my web page, I have given an CSRF token, and in the request that is sent, I'm not seeing that CSRF token, hence I'm rejecting it. In the legitimate user side, when the legitimate user is performing an legitimate email change, the first time when the request is sent to load the page, the server would be sending a CSRF token and would be stored in your browser. And for the further request that is going on, the CSRF token will be embedded into that request, and the changes happens. So ultimately, a typical scenario where this can be prevented actually. Now, the last set of vulnerability which I want to discuss about is called known vulnerable components vulnerability. I'm not sure whether most of you have heard about an organization called Equifax that went through a very major breach 2 to 3 years back, and it is on the financial sector, and it's an open documentation available to read about it. What they did is they found one of their Java dependent library being vulnerable to the attacks actually. And they found it, but then during their patch cycle, it took some time for them to mitigate that. But within that time frame, they pushed it from, I think, from March to May. By the time the attackers were able to find that and perform malicious intent and take all the customers sensitive data, I would say highly sensitive data, right until from the credit card details and all that. This is something related to the brand of that company, as well as it is also very crucial for that company as well, because their entire database of username, the first name, the customer name, their sensitive data like their phone number, their credit card numbers, their SSN numbers, all that breached by the attackers. What happened? It was just a very simple mistake where their Apache Struts library was not patched. And despite that, that was found by the Apache group, and they have released a subsequent version mitigating the vulnerability in the Apache Struts. But then the organization, finding that that is a very critical to it, and has failed to do that. That's something what we call as a known vulnerable component. Your component here, the component I would say is a library or a package or a Debian package or RPM package, respect to your RHEL or a Ubuntu machine, is vulnerable. And the criticality of a vulnerability lies in something called as what we call as a common vulnerability scoring system, CVSS. So every component which is there has some score associated with it. It is completely given by the respective organization which owns that package, and you can find that information in the NVD database. And when you go there, if you type for Apache Struts, it has a CVSS score associated with it for specific versions. And I think for Apache Struts, it was over 9. out of 10, which is very high critical and needs immediate attention if someone is using that set of version. Failing which, these kind of cost is something where the company or the organization is to bear about it. So this is about the known component vulnerabilities. How can you prevent the known component vulnerability? I would predominantly see that it's something where when a developer is using the code using some third-party libraries, it is essential as a practice for the developer to check in NVD to see if the version I'm using is having a lesser CVSS score. What are the vulnerabilities that it is tracking and all that, and before using it. And there is another measure that is also followed, which is what we call is in the CI/CD pipeline, we do something called as a software composition analysis. Your packages or libraries would be scanned against a tool. That tool connects back to NVD, and or it maintains its own database to correlate the CVSS score for all that, and says gives you a report which states that this library, this package contains this vulnerability, and the request is to modify that and patch it with the latest version of the same package and use it in your code. That's the typical expectation. So I think we have covered about the vulnerabilities part. Let's take a look at the DevSecOps side. I think most of you have heard about this term, which is very predominant in the market now. So we all know about the SDLC, software development lifecycle model. In the software development lifecycle model, essentially what happens is a developer, designs the system that software the developer is going to build, and once the various phases has been gone, like doing your class diagram, your sequence diagram, your activity diagram, all that. Once the design is completed, right until from that to your DFT, data flow diagram, what they do is they start doing the coding. Once they finish the coding, they deploy that finished code either in Java or Python, wherever it is, into your pre-production environment. And there they test it with the functional test cases. If it is a typical money being transferred from one account to another account, they try to mock the table and try to test it whether the full flow is happening correctly or not. And once they find that their functional test cases, they have listed like probably 50 to 60 cases they have listed for what this software was built. And if the functional test cases are satisfying to a percentage of like 80% or 90%, they push this code to the production. And when it is in production is where live customers can use that software to do the work that it is intended for. So when a developer is flowing through this phase, what as a security engineer you can do is travel with them in that phase. So when they are doing the designing, where they come up with an idea, they do the class diagram, they do the sequence diagram, they do the activity diagram, when they do the data flow diagram, version 1, version 2, and version 0, 1, and 2. During that phase, what we do something called as threat modeling. So what does the threat modeling do is, with that data flow diagram, you can subject some test cases to find out in case the flow that they are trying to do is vulnerable to some kind of attacks that we have seen. And is there a possibility of privilege escalation, right? When in a typical a Linux terminal, you use sudo to up level your current user level to a root user, like that. All these kind of privilege escalations are possible, can be checked out in the design phase itself, and tell them that some mitigations can be used that time. So what happens is some of these where when they are found in the production, they have to run through the same cycle again. But when it is known in the design level itself, they start coding with that secure practices. And once they have done the coding, they integrate, they do the deployment using something called as a CI tool, which is continuous integration. So they integrate their code into some of the CI tools in the market. And what they do is they do the scanning of, and in that phase, we have already discussed something called the software composition analysis. You can check their libraries or packages or dependencies, whatever the term we use. for some vulnerabilities in the live market. And as I already said, the CVSS code will be appended, something which is critical high are to be mitigated for sure. And what can the other way we can look at is, once the code is deployed in the pre-production, you can do some static analysis testing or dynamic analysis testing or interactive application security testing. These are tools in the market which you can deploy, and there are open source versions of it as well, and they can try testing this to see the code is vulnerable or not for some of the attacks just present. And say if they have moved to production and you are in a cloud, you can use some of the tools which right out of the native tools that comes from the cloud vendors, like web application firewall or runtime application self-protection. All those, these are agents that resides or tools that resides in the production environment. When it is being consumed by the live customers, they can use it so that we can prevent some of the attacks that is being lured or projected for this one. So I just wanted to cover about two famous attacks. One is called the Heartbleed attack. So the Heartbleed attack is nothing but so it's nothing where an package called OpenSSL, which we essentially use to communicate or set up a session between a client to a server in an encrypted channel. So when this package called OpenSSL, between the versions 1.01 to 1.01f had a vulnerability where, so when a typical client uses OpenSSL to connect to the server and has connected to it, and during some period of time, it sends some heartbeat messages from I think from its 6 KB to 64 KB. Those packets, when it is sent to the server, the server returns back saying that yes, it is still in the connection, is still open, it's still connected, and it's not still connected. All those informations are sent. So the attackers, what they did is they used this heartbeat intervals the client sends to the server, and started including some random code into it, asking for some informations to the server. So what happens is, when an heartbeat interval is sent, message is sent to the server, and in that message, the attackers have sent out some queries asking for what are the usernames present in the RAM. All this you dump it actually, and so the server processed all those informations. Whatever was stored in the RAM was being sent as a reply to the client actually, and it was dumped in the client's machine, and the attacker could take control of whatever the informations that was dumped from the server to the client machine. Typically in the scenario, if a server was attempting or has stored some encryption keys, passwords, or the credit card data of the user, when it was handling those informations, they were able to take control of it. And that's why the Heartbleed vulnerability was so famous, and it had a very big risk for any organization. So the update is to use anything above 1.01g and above. And MageCart is like a more of a typical a set of group of attackers were trying to use MageCart attacks to in the client side as a so it's a typical scenario where an organization can as a platform is working, and some of the smaller companies use their platform to develop their applications. So the MageCart attacks was targeted for those smaller companies which were using the company's platform, and they were trying to use to get into the bigger organization through those smaller companies. So that's the mitigation. That was a bigger attack, and still in the market, and it's still going on. It's a very big initiative that is driven for MageCart attacks. Okay. So coming back to your network security, these are your basics. So typically what happens when you type google.com in your browser. So when you type a google.com in your browser, the first packet that goes is to your IP stack and checks for your host record. to see if there is something. So for google.com, does it have the necessary information to connect? If it doesn't, it goes to your IP stack, and from IP stack, it goes to your typical router, and the router points to a gateway, and that gateway is where it goes to your public DNS server. The public DNS server in turn says that google.com is present in 4.2.2.2 or 8.8.8.8. And from there, it takes up that IP address and comes back to the browser. And the next packet is something what we call as a TCP three-way handshake. So from your browser to the IP address which it has got from the DNS server, it initiates the first packet called your SYN packet, SYN. And once the packet is sent to the Google server, the Google server in turn sends back the SYN-ACK packet, which is SYN-ACK, mentioning that, yes, I am present in this IP address, let's start the communication. And once the SYN-ACK is sent to the user browser, and the browser would return back a packet saying that, yes, I have received your message. Here is my acknowledgement, which is sent as a packet called ACK. And once this is done, there is an kind of an handshake or a tunnel or an interval is set between the Google server as well as your browser, where you can start acting it. Once the server has replied, so your first packet from your browser reaches to something called as your router. So your perimeter router is where I have mentioned it here. So you can see that. So perimeter router is one where your a typical packet from your browser reaches there. It contains your source address, that is your own IP address from your IP stack. And it also contains a destination address, which is your Google server. And once when it reaches the perimeter router, it checks for something called as an access control list. So the router would see in its table a typical database, and in that table it sees that whether does it allow this machine from this source address and accessing this destination address in this port number. If the action is yes, it permits that traffic, and the traffic hits your firewall. So the firewall is something where it so the router would sometimes the router has an ACL, but mostly it is routing the traffic to the firewall actually. So it's all the route that is sent to the firewall. The firewall would check for the access control list, asking whether the source address, destination address, and the port numbers are all matching. And once it is sent from firewall, it goes to your IPS or IDS module. So the IPS or IDS module is nothing but the firewall would check your traffic from layer 1 to layer 4 in the OSI OSI model. From layer 5 to layer 7, it is being inspected by the IPS or the IDS module. So it checks for your payload information, like if someone has sent an SQL injection payload or a cross-site scripting payload, all that would be something verified by the IPS, the intrusion prevention system or the intrusion detection system. Why do they say intrusion prevention or intrusion detection? So an intrusion prevention is something where if it finds that it's a legitimate attack, it will drop that traffic. If it is a detection system, it would send a reminder to the security engineer saying that it has found an abnormal or a malicious traffic. You have to take some information on that. And since it is going to the internal network, there is something called as a load balancer. So what happens to load balancer is you have your web connection, your application, your database, everything there. So it has to, there'll be like millions and millions of traffic load that is coming in. So this load balancer would, ensure that, the traffic is split and, addressed accordingly so that the web servers are not exhausted of the traffic connections. And apart from that, you can see some blue box with left and right arrows. These are called your switches. So, the switch has a concept called as a VLAN, virtual access LAN access network. Local area network. So what it does is you can split between two users who's handling different set of work. You can split it using something called as a switch, and these are something which acts at the layer 2 level in the OSI model. So this is a typical network. What happens in an organization when a typical, if you access a google.com, what happens at the back. This is what exactly happens. in a typical scenario where if there are attacks that is predominantly happening and targeted towards your organization, we have something from the ISP level. ISP is where it provides you the backend network to connectivity and all, and they have something called the scrubbing centers. We send your traffic to the scrubbing centers and mitigate all those DOS or DDoS traffics. Okay. I think let's step into the cloud security world. I wanted to cover on the cloud security module. I have considered here AWS as one of our cloud provider. So what happens is, in a typical cloud environment, a typical customer who is hosting their services or applications in the cloud can So, what they happens is, they will go to AWS and they will ask AWS that, they want such and such resources from them, and they would pay for that model. And in that case, what exactly happens is there is a mutual understanding between the customer and the AWS that in terms of security, the customer would control the security for the data which is residing in that the cloud environment, and the resources that we are going to use, those would be something where the the vendor who is giving the resources will be taking care. Here, typically AWS. So this is something called as a shared responsibility model that all the cloud vendors have, like Intel from AWS, GCP, Azure, all that. So what is the security they will be providing, and what is the security that the customer has to take control of? So this is one of the predominant models that is used in a typical cloud architecture. What exactly happen is it's like a typical scenario where the infrastructure is nothing but a firewall. We have something called as a concept called VPC, the applications, all that. So we have subjected into a separate, you can see the diagram here. So the client infrastructure is nothing but the front end page that you see. This is what is exposed to the, the typical customer who is requesting the source and, accessing any kind of, AWS environment they want to access. And the application is the customer's application they would like to host in the AWS, and that is something we want to expose to their customers, the customers to access and use it actually. From a cloud perspective, there are three types of services that is provided. One is called infrastructure as a service, another is called as a software as a service, and another is called as a platform as a service. So what we are currently discussing about is more of an infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. Software as a service is the customer who has hosted their application in the AWS, and their application is being given to some other platform developers to work upon as more of a software as a service model. Okay, so these are typical where it's a runtime cloud provides an execution of the runtime environment to the virtual machines. As in, like, if you want to in a data center, you use some web servers running there. It will be more of the servers, but it will be virtual machines which is running, and you can host your service in that. And storage and everything is based on what you want to do, and you can pay for what you want from the AWS side. So the infrastructure is something where at the host level, network level, and application level, you can prevent the security and controls on actually. So the management side is nothing but the application services, or the whatever we have seen, the storage infrastructure, everything is something that you can manage it from your front end, and all that can be done. And from the security, as I said, right, so the AWS would definitely take care of some of the security from the resources they are giving perspective, and the implicit expectation of the customer is to take care of the data that they are going to deploy in the cloud. Let's look at some of the best practices from the deployment in the cloud actually. So the first expectation is read through your cloud responsibility, shared responsibility model. and make sure that what is the data that you are accountable for to make it secure. And the next one is whatever the data that you are going to have it in a cloud, if it is a sensitive or a highly sensitive data like your first name, last name, your email address, your credit card informations, all those informations to be encrypted. And I already said, right, the data classification and handling is something, but where if you're having your customers informations, make sure that you classify them based on that severity and ensure how you want to handle it. Like encryption is a must for highly sensitive, and encryption is not for some of the publicly available informations and all that. And the next thing is you should monitor your infrastructure very much. Whatever the API calls it is making, or the traffic that is going flow in and out of your firewall and everything has to be monitored to see in case if it finds any malicious aspects, it is dropping some traffic, why it is dropping, and all those to be monitored actually. And access control is who is going to access your infrastructure, say from a developer to an architect. What are the permissions that you want to give for a developer and for architect? So all that has to be met. And your application or infrastructure, ensure that you do periodic penetration testing, so that you want to avoid some of the vulnerabilities and everything and which is coming in the market. And next is the last is security enablement. It is nothing but the developers who are doing the development and all that, give them an training on what exactly are the best practices they have to adhere to when they're handling the security in cloud. Let's get into the last session of our module, which is called adversarial machine learning. So I just wanted to give you an overview of what exactly adversarial machine learning is. So we are in the era of data, and machine learning is playing a predominant role in handling those data and giving them some real-time analytics and all that. So there is also a flip side to it. Security is becoming a very key there. So there are models which you churn out of using the data. The adversaries or the hackers are trying to exploit that models and ensure that they make them behave in a different way than what they are intended to. So for example, a typical scenario that I faced was I was able to confuse the model to not detect what it has to detect when I subjected an data to it. Say a typical scenario where it was reading through all the documents. It's an NLP model. It was reading through all the documents and making sense of the which is written in that document. But then when the document right, so I have subjected it with some noise into it and gave it to that. So the model was not able to detect whether it was a document itself. So typical scenarios like this, right? The model could be running some very classified data or all that, and when the data subjected to it is not something, the data that it has not seen before, then it is a typical scenario. It's a typical scenario where the model is going to fail and it is going to interpret in a different way. And like that, if they are going to send out some more examples like more payloads like this to the model to detonate, the model is going to literally fail and it is not going to perform what it has to be. So this is more of something from the adversarial machine learning side. So these are typical examples that it has been tested actually. A typical scenario where a self-driving car which is running on a reinforcement module was so usually when you see a stop sign when you're driving a car, it's important that you have to stop for it. But the stop sign symbol was modified in a different way where the model was not able to detect it actually. And these are typical scenarios when what will happen is the self-driving car, if it is not detecting a stop symbol, it is still going to drive through and might result in some kind of accidents and all that. These are not yet out, but then these are scenarios that the R&D team is researching on, and these are all available in the internet, so you can go and read about it actually. So what could be some of the fixes that can be happening? So whenever you're training a model, ensure that from a security perspective, how you can make sure the model is immune to it. So like what I said, right? Try to subject some documents, which is where the model finds it is difficult, and if it finds such things as how you want to handle those ways is something where you have to think through when you're churning out the model. So this is something one typical example which you can as a fix you can apply when you're building up your models. So I think we have come back to the end of the modules. So security, I think is not an afterthought anymore, and it's not something the organizations are only should take control of. I think it's from a user's perspective, they also to be aware of some basics of security, and it has to be adhered to as well.